So that is President John Mahama at the United Nations General Assembly, where he's seeking for the UN to recognize the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. Let's get talking, and joining me on Zoom is Professor Obadele Kambon of the University of Ghana. He is very passionate about this subject. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Tell us about your life story and how relevant it is to this subject of transatlantic slave trade and reparations. Kindly unmute your microphone so we can hear you. Hello, can you hear me? We're still trying to establish a connection to Professor Obadele Kambon of the University of Ghana. He's very passionate about this subject on transatlantic slave trade, as I mentioned earlier. Welcome to the program. I can see you now. Tell us about your life story, really, and how relevant it is to this subject of transatlantic slave trade and reparations. Do we have connection to Professor Kambon?
Can you hear me well?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I was saying that I've been following the discussion at the UN with regard to
We're still trying to establish a connection with him there. He's a professor at the University of Ghana, an African-American who is now a naturalized Ghanaian. So this story about transatlantic slave trade is dear to his heart, as I mentioned earlier. Let's try and reestablish connection with him one more time. Can you hear me this time?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Much better. You were making a point.
Yeah, so I've been following the discussions about the establishment of the transatlantic enslavement, the vote on that at the UN. And, you know, while we can definitely regard the transatlantic enslavement as the greatest crime in the history of humanity, one thing that I find puzzling, however, is the reason why it may have been divorced in some way, shape, or form from the trans-Saharan enslavement of Black people as well. Because with that, you can look at the Sidi people who were taken to what is now modern day India, coming from the eastern coast of the continent. And this goes back to 628 CE. You can look at even prior to that. You can look at even the enslavement of the people of classical Kemet by the Hyksos, and that dates to around 1550 BCE. Or you can come more recent and you look at the Zanj Rebellion. This is the first known rebellion of enslaved Black people in the diaspora, and it's the Eastern diaspora, and that one is taking us into 869 to 883 CE. And when we look comprehensively, you know, if we're looking at the transatlantic, aspect of enslavement, that takes us to 1441 CE, with the Portuguese coming and raiding along the coast, Antal Gonçalves and Nuno Tristão, under the behest of Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, who intentionally came and captured Black people. They were later joined by Lancelot de Freitas and others to capture over 200 people. And then this is the start of transatlantic enslavement. But again, if we look, collectively, this is much more than just transatlantic enslavement, because this is ongoing. When we look at the Arabs in these so-called northern African countries, like Libya, some years ago, there was a video on BBC where it was showing Black people who are being quote unquote sold on an auction in Libya, and there were actually protests, in front of the Libyan embassy. And when I saw that, I said, these people don't know what they're doing, because they also need to protest in front of the Morocco embassy, and also in front of the Tunisian embassy, and also in front of the Egyptian embassy and the Sudanese embassy, and all of these North African countries, because across the board, Black people are still being enslaved, to the point where when Morocco joined the AU in 2016, they had about 250,000 Black people enslaved, according to Global Slavery Index. So when we look at this, when we're looking at transatlantic, The question that puzzles me is why we would separate that from Trans-Saharan Indian Ocean, because those are actually the predecessors of the transatlantic one, and those are still ongoing. Like I said, as of 2016, I was looking at the data because I was comparing when Haiti applied to join the African Union, and they were told that according to 29.1 of the AU's Constitutive Act, only African countries, meaning those that are on the continent, can be members of the AU. Meanwhile, Haiti, that is much more Black and African, if that means anything whatsoever, than these countries that have been overrun by Arabs. And the point that I'm driving at is that we even know the dates on which the Arabs came into, this land that we now refer to as Africa. We know when they started the conquest, 639 CE under the Caliph Umar. We know in 652, this is when they had the Bak Treaty with Nubia, where they actually forced people to conscript other Black people as a tribute. And they said, okay, because you've been conquered, now you have to give us tribute in human beings. So this is, again, 652 CE. All of this predates 1441 in terms of the transatlantic enslavement of Black people. So it's definitely part of a much wider crime against humanity. And I would say it's the latter-day crime against humanity. And that one is still ongoing as well, because if you look at the U.S., according to the 13th Amendment of the U.S., it says slavery shall not exist within the U.S. or any place subject to their jurisdiction, except whereas the party has been duly convicted of a crime. Right. That caveat is how they were able to keep enslaving people through convict leasing, keep enslaving people through nowadays privatized prisons in the prison industrial complex. They intentionally put that into the 13th Amendment so that they could keep getting free labor from Black people, and that's what exists to this day.
Right. Don't go yet. Let me bring in Kweju Appiah-Tuah. He's a professor of law at the University of Ghana. Professor Appiah-Tuah, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. The demand for the recognition of transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity at the United Nations actually has some legal twists and turns to it, whether it passes or not. Tell us about it.
Thanks for having me. Yes, there is definitely a legal dimension to the whole slavery question and the reparations that President is demanding. When we look at the whole slavery issue, when it comes to reparations, they generally look at it from a moral point of view, that we can make a moral claim, but we cannot make a legal claim for slavery. But that is unfounded. There's a legal claim for slavery because at the time that the whole process started, slavery was illegal under international law. There's a principle in international law we call the jus cogens norms, which is a peremptory norm of international law. That is the highest form of international law principle. And at the time that the slavery was in place, the transatlantic slavery I'm talking about, the jus cogens principle had sought to delegitimize slavery as a practice. Moreover, in international law, there's a principle we call the persistent objector. When customary international law is emerging, states that take part in it in terms of state practice, with the backed by what we call the use the state practice and opinion juris. That is the legality attached to the state practice. That is what the two come together to consider what we call customary international law. And it's only, this customary international law only applies to states that take part in the practice. Right. And the historical facts clearly indicate that a number of these African empires and kingdoms at the time objected to the practice. Some even wrote letters to some of the European countries against the negative impact of the practice on their citizens, on their demography, and so on. So to me, that makes a strong case that international law did not legalize slave trade at the time. But then those countries that were benefiting from them, the European countries, sought to change the face of international law to make slavery legal. And so at a point in time in the history of international law, slavery was recognized as a legal practice. But this was based on customary practice. It wasn't based on a treaty law, for example, that there was a treaty that legalized slavery, except among the European countries at the time. And again, when we talk about treaties, if you don't sign and you don't ratify, you are not a party to that treaty. And at that time, African states, empires, and kingdoms had also been reduced to the status of not having sovereignty, and therefore they couldn't sign these treaties and to be part of it, even if they had wanted to. Okay, so on that basis, we can make a strong case that slavery, as a transatlantic slave trade at that time, was not legal. And therefore, if you are making claims for reparations, it shouldn't be based on moral arguments. It should be based on legal arguments that it was wrong. And if it was wrong 400 years ago and so on, it is still wrong today, because we are talking about slavery falling into the realm of international crimes against humanity. Yes, so there's no expiry date on when we can make claims.
Right.
Now, coming down to whether we can make the claims today, in principle, yes, as I said, we can argue on grounds of international law. But the process that we have now, going through the UN system, unfortunately, in my opinion, is not going to yield any results, because it's not the first time that Africa has attempted that, and it's not the second time. And even in 2001, there was a UN conference held in Durban, South Africa, which sought to came to a similar conclusion that slavery should be considered as a crime against humanity. Okay. And there is a beautiful document on that, but unfortunately, that has remained as a UN declaration, which is not binding, and therefore you cannot use it to make claims legally for the crimes that were committed in the past. Right.
Professor Appiah-Jatu, I'll come back to you. Let me bring in Professor Kambon in once again. You, as I mentioned earlier, are very passionate about this particular subject. There are concerns that no matter how it goes, whether the UN adopts or rejects this resolution, it will be a historic milestone. Do you share in that sentiment?
Well, Prof. Appiah-Jatu, actually a colleague of mine, we worked on various things together. I share a similar sentiment. There's a proverb that they use in the Caribbean where they say, in a court of fowls, a cockroach never gets justice. And that is to say the UN includes those that in the past were enslaving Black people and to date are still enslaving Black people. And that, includes the Arab states and what's now known as North Africa that I mentioned before. That also includes the US, which, as I mentioned before, according to the 13th Amendment, slavery shall not exist except where they've convicted a person of a crime. That includes, all of these other beneficiaries of ill-gotten gains who are still, gaining, through the continued enslavement of Black people or the past enslavement of Black people. So, according to Baba Omowale Malcolm X, there were these notorious criminals in the U.S. called Frank James and Jesse James. And he said that, to ask one to adjudicate on another is a futile effort because both of them are armed robbers. So if you ask one to say something against the other one, it implies his own guilt thereof. So, I think that just symbolically that there's something to be done there, but also there's a precedent for this as well. There's a very good book by Professor Nafafe, where Jose Linyan Nafafe, that goes into Lorenzo da Silva Mendoza and the Black abolitionist movement of the 17th century, where 1684 to 1686, a lot of people don't know this, he actually took a court case to the Vatican, because the Vatican is, through the papal bulls, they are the ones who actually said that slavery shall exist in perpetuity, perpetual enslavement. That was basically a new idea that these people, meaning Black people, and their children forever and ever would be enslaved. And again, that was the papal bull Dum Diversis, and then also Romanus Pontifex. So he said, well, because this is the religious justification of enslavement. Let me actually take the court case to there. It actually won the court case where some people were able to be brought back to Angola from Brazil. However, as we know, in 1686, that didn't end enslavement altogether. Most people don't even know that it was going on that far back. So, these are precedents that we can look at in terms of law, in terms of international law, in terms of cases that have been brought to the UN. Nana Paul Robeson and others brought this case, We Charge Genocide, again, trying to come to the UN. But I feel like because you have all of these people who are victims of enslavement, as well as all of those who are perpetrators of enslavement in the same body, then it becomes almost a contradiction in terms beyond the symbolic nature of things.
You teach African studies at the University of Ghana. How might this resolution influence the global teaching of the effects of transatlantic slave trade on Africans?
Well, I think it'll cause people to do more of what they do now, which is focus on transatlantic to the detriment of looking at trans-Saharan. And I feel like that's a major problem. So transatlantic, if we're going to cut off one aspect of the greatest crime in humanity, let's say someone, kicked in your door, burned down your house, killed all your family members, and say the burning is the only part that's the greatest crime against humanity. And it's like, well, what about killing all my family members? What about coming in and robbing me? What about all these other things that were going on? Because again, this is an entire complex. And I feel like part of the issue is we're focused on so-called Europeans as opposed to focusing on all of these Eurasians who have been enslaving Black people, going back millennia. So if we look at it comprehensively, we'll look at the role of the Arabs, we'll look at the role of the Indo-Aryans and what's now called India. We'll look at the role of the so-called Europeans, all Eurasians put together and what they have been doing and continue to do, with Black people. Right. Again, I think to answer your question directly, it will cause people to focus on the transatlantic portion of it as opposed to look at it comprehensively. As we used to do in classical Kemet, we refer to all these people from the continent of Eurasia as Amu. So whether they came from the peninsula that we now call Europe, whether they came from what's now known as Syria, whether it's what they now call Lebanon, wherever they came from, we had a blanket term to refer to all of these non-Black invaders and foreigners, and it was Amu, and literally it translates to foreigners. I feel like once we get back to an understanding from our own perspective in our own languages, it will help us understand the comprehensive nature of enslavement, not just the Western Eurasians, but across the entire continent of Eurasia, including what we now know as Europe, including what we now know as Asia, as the invaders, imperialists, enslavers of Black people comprehensively. And I feel like part of it is that we don't want to step on the toes of the Arabs who are still enslaving Black people and who are still on stolen land and are actually part of another body called the AU to the detriment of Haiti that cannot be a full member, but Morocco and other enslavers can still be full members. Right. These are major problems.
Obadele Kambon is an associate professor at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. We appreciate you giving us the benefit of your expertise. And I still have Professor Kojo Appiagyei-Tua, who is also at the University of Ghana. Professor, already we're hearing that the European Union and other European powers say that they will object to this resolution, really. And our demand for reparations, does it mean that it's in jeopardy, really? What happens to it if they vote against it? Can we take it to the ICC, ICJ? Where?
Well, within the international human rights, the UN system, there are certain processes and procedures and certain organs and institutions that depend on where the matter is being discussed or addressed, it will determine the extent of the legality that could be attached to that resolution being passed there or not. And so what is happening now is within the General Assembly level. And traditionally, that should have been the most democratic institution or organ of the UN. Because that is where each country has one vote. But unfortunately, within the General Assembly, the decisions that are taken, the declarations and the resolutions that are passed there are not binding, legally binding. They are only advisory or recommendatory. So what is going on there, at the end of the day, even if it gets overwhelming support of votes, which is likely to be the case, the question is, who are those who would abstain or who would vote against? At the end of the day, is the majority, it's not about the majority that vote for, but it is those who hold hegemonic influence in international relations, who, when they vote against, are able to collapse the application of this particular resolution that will be passed. And that has happened before. And so in the 70s, we talked about a new international economic order, which was another means to redress past injustices through the slave trade and colonialism. And many other attempts have been made. But most of these resolutions which were passed remain only of academic interest because the big powers voted against it. And so this, what our president is doing, is not something that is the first thing that is being done. And I'm not surprised that the former colonial authorities would say they will vote against it. So when they vote against it, that means that it is just going to be shelved. It's going to be debated in academic circles and the classrooms and so on. But in reality and in practice, it is not going to make much impact on the ground.
Right. Kojo Appiah-Jaitua is a professor of law at the University of Ghana. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. You're still watching the polls here on Joy News. When we return from the break, we have more stories for you.